And we're back. Welcome back from the weekend. Today, we will continue on our discussion with feature selection, and we'll go to something called MDS, or multidimensional scaling. Now, multidimensional scaling, the reading for this is at the following URL. Please make sure you read through that. It's a pretty easy read, goes through some of the background, what it's doing, talks about metric and non-metric MDS. So when we last left off, we talked about the idea of what a manifold is, and we motivated that with two different diagrams. One, this figure on the right, which represents points in a hypercube in R3, three-dimensional real value space. And to do so uniform at random, we sampled with replacement points in the unit hypercube. Now that represented points in feature space in R3, and you notice that these points occur everywhere throughout our space, and that's not typically what happens with your data in feature space. What is typical is your data only occupies some subset of the possible points in feature space. Moreover, they reside on some kind of surface representing a subspace of your original representational space. Now, certainly here, for the unit simplex in R3, I've drawn it. These points occur on a single sheet, but it could absolutely be some other arbitrary surface in multiple dimensions that twists and folds and bends and has little bumps and all sorts of contours along this surface. And so this surface has a name. We said it's a manifold, and this manifold has a shape. And we looked at two different types of nonlinear manifolds, the 3D spline and the Swiss roll, and we argued that the variability of these points, and demonstrated it, proceed in various directions, different from the original axes in R3 that represent all points in space. And so for the spline, 3D spline, they vary in this direction, from left to right, and along this curved direction. And same thing for the Swiss roll. And so the idea then is, if we can recover this low dimensional surface along which data point values or feature values you encounter in your data actually occur, can we recover it in 2 dimensions instead of in 3 dimensions? So that was the ask. And we talked about isometric feature mapping, or Isomap, and it's a graph-based approach based on this idea of geodesic distances, geodesic meaning respecting the relative neighborhoods, the local neighborhoods among points or values among points that you have. And so this geodesic represents the shortest curve along the manifold, and it's an approximation of the ground truth surface or manifold. And here we have the underlying manifold. Your data points are samples, or thought of as samples, along the manifold. And so to compute these geodesic distances in order to draw relationships between data points, we connect them using our k-nearest neighbor graph, and we make the assumption that the local patches along this manifold are well approximated by a linear segment. So we have this locally linear assumption. And so in doing so, we now want to take the distance between, say, vertex B4, data point 4, and data point 12. Well, we construct the path along those nearest neighbor graph edges in order to calculate the total edge weights or distance that we encounter. And in doing so, now when we measure distances, we're measuring those distances along routes associated with actual values, feature values for data points that do occur. And so we went into this Isomap procedure. You construct your nearest neighbor graph. You build your adjacency matrix. You weight the edges using Euclidean distance, run Dijkstra's algorithm for all pairs shortest path along this nearest neighbor graph. You get your distance matrix. You take this distance matrix and construct an affinity matrix using the centering matrix to center the columns and center the rows by left multiplying and right multiplying. And then you diagonalize this affinity matrix using the eigendecomposition. The top k eigenvectors corresponding to the top k largest eigenvalues, you take those as your new representation, the eigenvectors, the top k eigenvectors, and then you project your data onto these top k eigenvectors, and that's your new representation. And that new representation respects the geodesic distances. So let's take a look at multidimensional scaling. Certain problems exist where the relationships between your data, i.e. the neighborhood, is most important. Let's take a look at these space images. In the first column, column A, we have a normal or high resolution version. And then in column B, C, D, and E, we have subsequently lower resolution versions of these pictures. Now, one of the thoughts in this experiment is how do you match the low resolution images to the high resolution images? Now, I don't know about you, but if they weren't organized this way, it'd be kind of hard for me. Well, maybe this one looks a lot like its high resolution images, but once we get down to this type of resolution, it's kind of hard to match it. But you can look at the relative relationship between this version of resolution, that one, this one to the next one, this one to the next one, and then ultimately to the high resolution. So you can look at these relative relationships pairwise and represent the neighborhood among these different versions in proximity to the original high resolution image. And so matching low resolution images is very straightforward to do using this multidimensional scaling. And the goal here is not just the content of the image that's important for recognizing which low res is associated with high res, it's also the relative relationship between the resolution each step along the way that gets you to some high resolution version of the image. Because these degradations in resolution are of a certain sort. This might be a 50% degradation. This might take the next one and do another 50%, and so forth. And so by looking at the relative relationship as a result from the degradation of the images going from higher to lower resolution, that neighborhood information, that relative relationship information pairwise between these images becomes very important to understanding what belongs together. And so this idea that proximity matters is what is captured by multidimensional scaling. And it's going to employ pairwise distances between the individual instances. Now, when we say distance, it could be a measurement of similarity, how like one another two pieces of data are, or how unlike one another they are. And so let's employ these pairwise distance measures between the instances, and let's assume we have vector-valued instances in d dimensions. And so for the ice data item, it's going to be represented as the first feature, second feature, fourth feature, etc., up to including the dth feature. So that means each vector I is drawn from the set of RD, which is d-dimensional real-valued space. And so we have n of these images, big N, so that's the size of the data set, and each data point is in d-dimensional feature space. So now we're going to compute a dissimilarity matrix. And this dissimilarity matrix, in this case, we're going to use the L true norm, or even the magnitude of the difference pairwise between the ith vector and the jth vector describing the ith data item and the jth data item. So we compute this dissimilarity matrix, and so because we have n many data points, this dissimilarity matrix is going to have n rows, and it's going to have n columns, so this dissimilarity matrix, or similarity matrix, is going to be of rank n by n. And so the goal that we have is to try to find a new representation to go from d dimensions, r super d, to k dimensions, where k is less than d. So we're going to reduce the dimensionality, and in reducing the dimensionality, we're reducing the number of measurement types or the number of features. So we're going to go from d many features to k many features, and we want to do so that we preserve the relative affinity or the relative relationships pairwise between all the points in our data set. So we're trying to preserve this similarity matrix. And often when we do this, we use a relatively small k, 1, 2, or 3 dimensions, because we enterprise to do this for visualization purposes, and you can only visualize something well in 1, 2, or 3 dimensions. So let's take an example, and let's imagine we have 5 vectors, x1, x2, x3, x4, and x5. So we have 5 rows, and then likewise we have 5 columns, one for x1, one for x2, one for x3, one for x4, and one for x5. And of course, each entry is going to be the similarity or dissimilarity between the vector along the row and the vector corresponding to the column. So you notice here the main diagonal, it's all zeros. And that's because the similarity between a vector and itself is going to return 0. They're not different from one another if you treat this as a dissimilarity matrix. So let's assume that we have the following dissimilarities. So x1 is 1 different from x2, x1 is 2 different from x3, and likewise 3 different from x4, and 4 different from x5. Now, certainly, if you have these points in 3-dimensional real-valued space, you can actually preserve these relative distances, but reduce the dimensionality down to 1, a one-dimensional representation of this dissimilarity matrix. So here's that representation. We call this our x1 point. We call that our x2. We call that our x3. We call this our x4. And lastly, we call this our x5. So in that case, well, if this distance, each one of these segments is of distance 1, precisely we get back a preservation of this dissimilarity matrix. Okay, let's see. Dissimilarity between x1 and x2, that's 1. x1 to x3, that's 1, 2. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so this dissimilarity matrix is preserved. And we can take these points in 3 dimensions and map them down to 1 dimension. We can do the same thing with points in R3, mapping that onto 2 dimensions. And let's imagine now we have our data points, and let's say this is x1. Let's call this x2, and this one is x3. Now, of course, these rows, that's x1, corresponds to x2, and this corresponds to x3. And these columns, there's x1, x2, and lastly, x3. Now, if we look at these distance measures, okay, well, the distance between x1 and x2 is 3, between x1 and x4 is 4. Now, if we were to take these vectors in R3 and map them into 2 dimensions, so k equals 2, we'd imagine that these are vertices on the right triangle, which have edges that are in proportion 3, 4, 5, sometimes called the 3, 4, 5 right triangle. So nonetheless, if we imagine this arrangement, guess what? It's represented in 2 dimensions, a triangle, and we preserve this dissimilarity matrix. So x1 to x2, that's distance 3, x1 to x3, that's distance 4, x2 to x1, that's distance 3, x2 to x3, that's distance 5, and then lastly x3 to x1, that's distance 4, x3 to x2, that's distance of 5. And then the mean diagonal, again, is all zeros. So absolutely, it's possible to do this, reducing your dimensionality. In each case, we reduce the dimensionality in the first case from R3, dimensionality 3, down to 1. And in the second case, we reduced our dimensionality from k equals 3, from d equals 3, down to a dimensionality of k equals 2. So absolutely, this is possible. So we take our dissimilarity matrix and we square it. We square it because we want to make sure that we're looking at magnitudes, okay? And then we're going to center it using the same centering matrix that we talked about before. So let's define J as our centering matrix. That's identity minus 1 upon n times the outer product between the one vector with itself. So that's a matrix that 1 upon n times one vector outer product with itself is just a matrix, n by n matrix of all 1 over n entries. So we subtract that from identity, and that's going to be our centering matrix. We left multiply centering matrix times our dissimilarity to center the columns, and then we right multiply the dissimilarity matrix squared by the centering matrix to center the rows. Okay, and so we treat this like an affinity matrix, so we negate it like we talked about before with Isomap. And you'll note here this dissimilarity matrix, it does not use geodesic distances. It's direct line L2 norm type distances. So these are Euclidean distances. They are not geodesic distances. That's an important distinction between MDS and Isomap. And so we then diagonalize our matrix B, our centered dissimilarity matrix, and we then take as our new representation, depending on how many vectors you want or the dimensionality of your new representation, you take the k largest eigenvalues, which is your lambda 1 through lambda k, and those are associated with the k largest eigenvectors. So the eigenvalues are associated with the eigenvectors, and then we take those respective k largest eigenvectors and we project or multiply by the respective eigenvalues to get our new solution. We do this projection. And so that's going to be our new representation. So here's an example with the unit tetrahedron. This is a four-sided polygon in 3 dimensions in R3. So we have the surface that's along here. That's one surface. Surface along here. We have the surface that's on the ground, so to speak, and then we have this hidden surface. So we have this tetrahedron, and it's called the unit tetrahedron because each one of these edge lengths is 1. It's standard edge length, all 1. Okay, so it kind of looks like a pyramid. So we take this, and we have 4 vertices. We have vertex 1, x1, that's a vector, x2, x3, and x4. That should be an x, x4. Now, if we take our dissimilarity matrix and we look at the difference between them, here's our x1, x2, x3, x4, and these are our columns, x1, x2, x3, and lastly, x4. Now, the distance, okay, between x1 and everything else is 1. So x1 to x2, that's 1. x1 to x3, that's 1. x1 to x4. Similarly for x2, 3, and 4. So these are our entries, and of course, main diagonal, it's all zeros. So there's our dissimilarity matrix. So we take our affinity matrix, that's our B, and we compute the eigenvalues, and the eigenvalues in order of size, 0.5, 0.5, 0.50. And you can actually do this in MATLAB and verify it. And now, if you were to reconstruct it, the unit tetrahedron, in 3 dimensions using the first eigenvector, the second eigenvector, and the third eigenvector, you get back the tetrahedron in R3. So absolutely, this means that this approach of taking the Euclidean affinity matrix, you could call it that, B, which is the centered dissimilarity matrix, and you take some number of eigenvectors, the top ones, in order of their variability in terms of the direction along which variability occurs. Those are associated with the top k eigenvalues. You can absolutely reconstruct this figure, and you're preserving the dissimilarity matrix. Okay, so that's all I had to say about multidimensional scaling. There's not a lot to it. It's very related to Isomap, but there's an important distinction here. With multidimensional scaling, it is an affinity matrix that you're diagonalizing, but this affinity matrix involves a dissimilarity, whereas the distance measure for Isomap involves the geodesic distances computed through Dijkstra's algorithm over the k nearest neighbor graph. It's a really important distinction. All right, so this does not preserve the neighborhood structure per se. It's not geodesic, so it does not respect the curved surface, but it does respect the relative relationship between points that you are given in your data set. Okay, so that's all I had to say. Kept it short on purpose because I want to give you all some time to work through your image clustering assignment that we talked about last time. So with that, as usual, please stay healthy, please stay safe, and I'll see you all on Thursday.